lounging, son.
Welcome back to the Comic Lounge. My name is Ryan, and with me today, I have Dan DiDio. Long comics, worked as a publisher at DC for most of the 2010s into 2020. You got Frank Miller Presents coming out, which I'm super excited for. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here, man.
Yeah. So, every time I talk to somebody for the first time when I'm chatting with them, I always like to ask, like, what started your love for comics?
Oh, that's a love story that started over 50 years ago. As a kid, as a young kid, I actually saw the Adam West Batman show when it was on the air live when it first broadcast. Same thing with the Spider-Man cartoon from the 60s as well, and really enjoyed those. I enjoyed newspaper strips. Loved the monster movies, horror movies. So I started to pick up some horror comics along the way, and then slowly that got me more and more into the other types of genres. And then once I was into superheroes, I was pretty much hooked, and reading pretty much steadily for almost over 50 years, probably, if you want to count it right.
And you started your career, like, before getting into comics, you were in animation, correct?
Oh yeah, no, I did. Before I joined DC, I actually I'd worked at CBS TV and ABC television, and then was one of the creative executives on an animation company, the first computer animation company for TV called Mainframe Entertainment. So I had a chance to do some script writing with them and really some world building with those guys. And then ultimately, I moved over to DC in 2002. So I was actually with DC for almost 20 years for my time there, starting as an executive editor, starting in editorial, and then becoming the executive editor, then ultimately one of the publishers.
Right. Yeah, I think at first time I saw your name was when you took over Superboy, leading to the end, like right before that run ended.
Yeah, actually, that's a funny story because I had started on Superboy writing with Jimmy Palmiotti. Actually, Jimmy got the call. He asked me to join him, and together we pitched an idea and ultimately wound up on the book. But while I was doing Superboy with Jimmy, independently, I was interviewing with Paul Levitz for an executive position within the company. So I was on these two parallel tracks with DC, and then ultimately the tracks crossed, and I wound up sticking with the editorial side and going from there.
Yeah, the editorial side of comics has always kind of interested me because, like, I'm not I'm not an artist, and I write a little bit, but I think, like, you can tell when a book is being bad or badly edited. I don't know how else to say it, so I think, like, people that like comics don't really pay attention to that side of the industry. I think that it's really important to realize when you have really good editorial directorship.
Yeah, and it's a real juggling act when you're editing. And I always laugh because the best editor is the one that they don't notice. So all the praise goes to the talent, and then ultimately, if a book doesn't work, they seem to get all the blame. But the reality is, the editor is there to help steer the ship, to bring that level of consistency and voice, especially on characters that multiple people worked on over the years, and might be working on at the same time. So you want somebody who can bring some sense of consistency. Continuity is a word that we throw around, but when I say continuity, I mean making sure that the character moves and acts the same way so they don't feel wildly different from book to book. And then also being clear about a direction, about making sure there are goals that every issue and every book is trying to achieve, and make sure you're able to get that from the talent. And it takes a lot of work to be able to work with talent who have very strong personal visions on things, and to make sure you're able to get what you want, but make sure they feel like they're getting what they want at the same time. So it's a deft hand, and knowledge of art and knowledge of writing and knowledge of the English language always come in handy in order to be able to craft the position properly and to do your job well.
And what were some of, like, because I mean, like you said, you were writing the comic with Jimmy Palmiotti, but you quickly were up in the high ranks of an editorialship, and then became publisher just a few years after that. What were some of your, like, your personal goals, like, that you wanted to see done with the line? Because I mean, there was a lot of changes throughout your tenure, from editorialship to your time as publisher.
Yeah, well, my job was I was brought in to shake it up, if you want to be honest. There was a level of it was rather lethargic, the line, and wasn't much movement taking place, and they sort of worked themselves into a corner. So I was brought in to really help not just shake up the creative direction, but also how the projects were created and actually the product workflow. I spent my first year actually doing an analysis of the company on how it works and what's the best way to proceed. And once we built the foundation of how we were able to work, then we figured out what we were going to be working on, which was a lot of time and energy and a lot of headbutting, and a lot of negotiation along the way, because there were so many extraordinarily talented people at DC with a lot of experience, and I was coming in from the outside. And I had to learn what I was talking about before I started to offer suggestions on how to improve it. So we spent the first year figuring it out, and then the second year implementing it, and then by the third year we were into the creative, and then we're off to the races.
And what's the difference in terms of like being like an executive editor as opposed to being the publisher? What is the day-to-day differences in that?
There are some different. The biggest difference is the editorial. You're really worrying about the creative direction and the focus of the books and the voice of the books, and the quality of the relationship of the talent and the quality overall. When you're looking at a publisher job, you're looking at the profitability of the line, how much money you're making, how you're interacting with your bosses above, with the parent corporation, and then also, more importantly, making sure you're maintaining a consistency of voice and message that plays across not just the comics, but every other aspect of how you push those characters out in other medium. So you're really trying to negotiate the sensibilities and be profitable along the same way. I hate using that word, but that's what you're judged on. You're judged on how successful and how financially successful books are. And there's always that problem of that when you make something successful, then they want it to be even more successful the following year, which is always the big challenge.
Yeah, I think I mean, I can realize that, and I'm sure other fans can too, like when they want their favorite characters to have a book and it doesn't last very long, and it's because the sales aren't there. I think that's a lot of argument with people in terms of there's so much Batman, that like they'll make that argument. It's like, well, it's because you all keep buying Batman books, which is why they keep putting it out.
That's the same argument of variant covers or event books too.
Right.
As we always used to say, we're making what the market calls for, and if the market calls for it, I mean. But when I was there, I put a limit on the amount of Batman books. We were only allowed, this is going to sound weird, but we didn't want to let more than 1/3 of the line be Batman centric or derivative Batman material, primarily because if you have a stool and it's a two-legged stool, one is Batman and one is everything else, one of the legs break, the whole thing breaks. If you have a three-legged stool, there's a good chance you can balance yourself until you get that third leg fixed again. So the goal is to make sure you had as much, in my mind, variety of product, because if something loses favor, you don't want to be out of work, because you relied on it so heavily. And we could talk about Batman as the perfect example, and everybody goes, how can Batman lose favor? Well, guess what? In the 60s, Batman was the #1 driver of DC Comics for a number of years when the Batman TV show was on with Adam West. When that show failed, the entire line almost went with him. And honestly, if you go into the 70s, ultimately until when Dark Knight Returns premieres, Batman's a top 40 seller, not a top 1 seller. Robin and other books would sell better than a Batman book. It was not driving the line. It's not until Dark Knight comes out, and then ultimately the Michael Keaton Batman movie comes out, that Batman achieves this golden status that it's luckily been able to maintain since then. But it's not to say that it can't be broken. Everything can be broken given time.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something that I have a younger brother. We have 11.5 years between us, but like I got him into comics, and that's that tenure of like when I got him into it in like the mid 2000s. That was he always tells me that was his favorite time at DC. Like there was so many of his characters were around, and I felt like it's evident, like with you, that you always were trying and experimenting, bringing in those. I don't want to say, I hate saying like C-list or D-list, but like the lesser.
Those are my favorites.
Yeah, but like
I love every one of those characters.
Yeah, same here. But like the lesser known characters to the mass public, and I think it was really evident, especially when you guys relaunched New 52. I know that there's so many conflicting feelings about that time at DC. I think it was probably one of the boldest moves I've seen since I've read comics, in terms of taking an entire line and restarting, keeping what was good, getting rid of what wasn't working. How important was that for you with the initial launch? I know that eventually some books drop off, but
Yeah.
to really create so many, you brought so many different genres back. I mean, you had the Weird Western Tales, you had like the Frankenstein Agent of Shade, like just such random books. But how important was that to you to really like
that was essential. That was the only way it was going to work for me. Primarily, if you remember, we had I Vampire, we had War Book, Men of War. We had so many different things because, again, when I first started collecting comics, and when I was really buying DC in the 70s, if you go to the 70s, DC Comics, only 40% of the line was superhero. 40%. That means it was 60% other. It was war, it was science fiction, it was Western, it was romance, it was comedy, it was everything else. And it's not until you go into the direct market that the direct market deems that only superheroes should survive here and everything else had to go away. And in the 70s, there were profitable other books that were canceled in order to make room for new superhero books for the direct market. So we walked away from this business, and I felt that was always the defining difference between DC and Marvel, was the variety in product, because ultimately Marvel would do other styles of story, but they would all feel like superhero books. Even their monster books feel like superhero books.
Yeah.
DC's monster books felt dramatically different, so much so that allowed them to create the Vertigo line, because there was such a point of difference on how these characters act and behave. That's what made DC fascinating to me. So that's how I knew DC. So when I got there to be in a position to help drive the creative, I was working from the spots that made me excited about the company. When you're working in a job like a superhero line like that, you're supposed to be successful with Superman, Batman, and Justice League. You're supposed to be successful there. And if you're not, that's a failure. But if you're successful with Animal Man or Frankenstein or Olmec, that's a monster win, because ultimately it's the books that people didn't expect to succeed. And your greatest wins come from the strangest places. I mean, Neil Gaiman on Sandman is an amazing win, because nobody expects a book like Sandman to work, and when it does, it becomes a way to expand yourself and grow who you are, more so than just what people expect you to be, which is Batman and Superman.
Right. And then in terms of like you brought a lot of new talent into DC at that time. There was a lot of creators that hadn't previously been there. I think like obviously one of the biggest ones was getting like Greg Capullo teamed up with Snyder on Batman. I think like, he wasn't working at DC. He was still remembered from Spawn and like his early days at Marvel. How do you go about deciding like who to go after? Because I feel like I could be wrong in terms of my history and my facts, but the exclusivity contracts that were being given to like the higher up in terms of talent, I feel like was in the mid 2000s. So like, especially into your
that was something I drove. Yeah, the exclusive at the high point, we had almost 150 talent on contract, 150 contracts, and the reason why was something that I did early on, which was that I found I had a lot of talent working at DC. But they never took DC as seriously as they did Marvel. So when Marvel called, they would put a DC book aside to take a Marvel assignment. So I never had any level of consistency. And whenever we had somebody that was becoming a breakout, Marvel would go after them pretty heavy and try to pull them over. And there's the allure of the Marvel characters that honestly wins out over the DC more times than not, with the talent. So what I did is I put a lot of people under contract so they could not be distracted by Marvel. And they can be and know that they have a commitment from a company that's going to support them for an extended period of time, gives them that sense of security in a job, which I think they really liked. And then we were able to work with them on page rates and things of that nature to make them feel more vested in the company. And I think that paid out very strong dividends for us in the long term, because ultimately, the more I worked, more that they worked for us, the more they felt that sense of ownership and possession and belonging while working at DC. And I think they made a lot of the talent feel valuable because they were valuable. And we got some really great work for them because of that.
Yeah, I think that was, I always liked paying attention to that, to see like who you guys or Marvel would snatch up and you're like, okay, now we're getting, I know I'm getting like a lot of stuff from this creator. at DC, or in terms of Marvel too, the same thing. I think probably one of the bigger ones too towards the end of your tenure at DC was getting Bendis over from
Yeah, I
Marvel.
mean,
I remember how
I was
people
gonna say
lost
we
their
were trying to
shit.
get him for a while, but he was pretty settled. He was pretty
Yeah.
settled over there, and the time was right. And it's a lot of times. And by the way, if somebody felt like they were languishing in DC, we would end their contract so that they would be able to grow if they felt they were repeating themselves. I think with Bendis, I think he had been at Marvel for so long and was the voice of that for so long that he probably needed to change also. And the timing seemed right to make that move, so it worked out well.
And then I just, not to like stir the pot or anything, but I'm just kind of curious. Everybody has always said about like Nightwing and how, like, I think at one point you wanted to kill him or something. I don't know. I could be getting this wrong.
Did.
I just want to know,
no, still
like,
do.
what the deal was with that. I want to ask you, like, first.
It's a really simple story. Actually, no, it's a funny story. So what happened was we were in Infinite Crisis. And the story of Infinite Crisis was that Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were fractured. They were not talking to each other. They were going their own way. And because they were breaking up and not dealing, the rest of the infrastructure of the DC Universe heroes was coming apart too. And at the same time that these three were not working in unison, it threw off the ability of the heroes to perform to their best of ability. So Infinite Crisis hits, all these dramatic dangers are occurring, and our heroes are fractured, and the world's at risk. And they couldn't put aside their differences enough to reunite because of what was happening. I said I needed a defining moment that would make all of our heroes put all of their anxiety and anger aside and rebond. And I looked at Nightwing as being that one character. That's a character that was so important to not just Batman, but to Superman and Wonder Woman. He mattered to every one of them. He mattered to the DC universe so much that ultimately, if Nightwing was to die, he was the one thing that level of grief I felt would bring everybody together and put their differences aside, then unite to fight the greater common, villain that they were up against. That was the big story. And also, because we're doing Infinite Crisis, it was a direct sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. We wanted that big death. In Crisis on Infinite Earths, they killed Supergirl and the Flash, two extraordinarily mainstay characters. Basically, the Flash is the character that kicked off the Silver Age, and he dies in that book. So those are big moments, and I wanted that same big moment in Infinite Crisis, and Nightwing was the character. Plus, there was a sense of redundancy on Nightwing at that time. You had Tim Drake becoming much more prominent as Robin. Nightwing was sort of between Batman and Superman. I mean, Batman and Tim Drake, and he was a little lost in there. And I used to tell people, I used to say to them, I had a lot of people that were fans of the Nightwing book, and yet nobody was able to even refer or remember a main big defining story for Nightwing. It's a book that ran for over 100 issues, but never really made an impact. Right. So ultimately, that was the push, and it was up there to the very end. And then ultimately, I got overruled, and they switched out, and they brought to Connor Kent, which I didn't feel was as strong, but it served the purpose. But and that was it. We move on. So anyway, so I go to a convention, and I'm relaying this story. And during my relaying of this story, there's this woman in the front row of the convention with a Nightwing shirt on. And every time I said I wanted to kill Nightwing, she would scream, throw her hands up in the air and scream in the top of her lungs, like I just stabbed her. And everybody in the panel thought that was funny because of her reaction. It was very cute. It was wonderful. It was spontaneous. And you could tell she was having fun too. Well, we all started saying how we wanted to kill Nightwing. So that became the running joke. And ultimately, it became a little bit of a signature joke for us during the convention season. So by the time I finished convention season, I have this reputation of wanting to desperately kill Nightwing, which I did, which is, I'm perfectly owning up to that. But it was more because we were playing into our audiences and having some fun with it, Right. But then once we didn't kill him, we had to figure out to make something better. And I think they did some nice jobs with them going forward from that point on. But I still think it would have been a better story because I think it would have given me more story. Because then it was about. Remember, we had just brought back Jason Todd also. So now right. I have the broken Nightwing, which was going to be the broken Nightwing, trying to live up to a reputation he could never do. Tim Drake feeling like he's a poor replacement for somebody else, and then ultimately Titans becoming apart because this leader is lost, and who steps up to take the place. There was all this great opportunity and story coming from that single event that I felt we got better stories with him dead than when he was alive. So that's why I do it.
Okay.
You know?
I mean, I
It's
can
not
admit,
about.
if I take myself out of like the fact that, because I love Nightwing too, he's like one of my favorite characters, so I was upset, but I can't argue the fact that like, and I like Superboy, but it didn't have the same impact, not even close as, and I kind of like almost want to know the stories that could have come from that, but I do like, I think that. Oh, go ahead.
No, go finish what you're gonna say. Finish.
Oh, I was gonna say, I do agree though, like maybe because of that, that kind of lit the fire under people's ass, like to do something, because I think that what Scott Snyder did with Jock and Francesco Francavilla on when he took over the role of Batman was probably the best Dick Grayson stories we've had, and I can't even.
Oh, that's we had that was actually Grant Morrison did it when Batman dies, Batman R.I.P. and Nightwing takes over. That is honestly my favorite run of Batman while I was in the company, besides Hush, I have to say. And why I say that is that Grant did it right. When Grant pitched me this story, what Grant said was that Dick Grayson is going to become Batman, but he's still Dick Grayson, which means he has Dick Grayson's personality in the Batman suit, which is not Batman. And then he says, but I need that Grim Avenger. So the Robin is going to be the Grim Avenger. So, because he was the killer and as Damian. So what he did is he took the paradigm and flipped them. Well, and let every character be true to who they were. And the new dynamic still worked. It's one of the best examples of moving the story forward and making consistent with people's expectations of who the characters are. I think that's what worked so well during Grant's run of Batman. And I think, like I said, that's one of my favorite bits, and I love that to death. I love that because ultimately we did come up with a storyline where Dick Grayson was going to ultimately replace Batman, and we knew we had to do it short-lived, but Grant found the best way to do it, and it worked out great. And that for me, that's the best Dick Grayson story is when he was Batman.
I agree. It was definitely like some of my favorite comics during that period. So before we kind of get over into what you're currently doing, I just was curious if you could share like a couple of your, favorite or defining moments of your time at DC, something that you're like super proud of that you.
It's funny people ask me that, and the problem is that you're there 20 years, you have a lot of them. It's not just one moment. It's because if it was only one. I was going to say it this way: if it was only one moment, then you probably wasted 19 years.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was why I'm always pitching and choosing and pushing and trying different things. And my favorite time was probably from Countdown to Infinite Crisis to the weekly series 52, the end of that series, mainly because everything was fresh and it was doing everything for the first time, and it was the first time we're trying all that stuff. And it was hard to maintain that momentum and constantly push that stuff forward, as you had to constantly do new events and new storylines. So that was a great time for me. The new 52 launch was a great time for me because it showed me the entire company working together in a manner that it hadn't done up to that point. And everybody, I would say every single person working at DC was vested in that project. And I think that's why it worked from the start. And then I love all the little quirky corners. One of the fun parts for me, I love creating new characters. The New Age of Heroes was fun for me. The ones that I really had wild fun with, more fun than I should have had, was things like the Looney Tunes stories, or when we crossed over with Hanna-Barbera and we did new takes on the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. Because for me, that was taking what I loved as a kid and my previous work in animation and then mixing it with comics. So there's a lot of fun stuff there, and there's a lot of good people I worked with, and everything from Grant Morrison launching Seven Soldiers of Victory to Jeff's doing Blackest Night, to our relaunch of Green Lantern, to our several tries and takes at the Doom Patrol over the years, and Gerard Way stuff and all these different things that we did. And one of the last things we did was brought Joe Hill in, and I thought that was great because now I had a new creative leader for a new line of horror books. So again, you hear in these moments, and I could probably go on endlessly, and it's funny, I have a bookshelf of what I deem to be my sweet spots, and it's all lined up in a nice
Cool.
way, and all the events and all the things are side by side, and it becomes a chronology of your time there, which is even more fun because it reminds you of what was accomplished over those periods of time. It's not one moment; it's a lot of things, and that's what counts.
Yeah, for me, I definitely loved. There's a lot of awesome stories that have stuck with me, or to me, I consider some of my favorite runs during your tenure. So many stories to pick from. I mean, I realize asking you to pick favorite moments from 20 years, we could
Yeah.
just spend a couple hours talking
Yeah,
about
I
that.
go, I
So
could go on there because with every story you have, there's a good side of it and a bad side of it,
yeah,
and there's a lot of stuff that should have worked that didn't work. There's a lot of stuff that shouldn't have worked but did work. Oppositely, and for me, I finished up my tenure with writing Metal Men, which I say were my favorite characters at DC.
mhm.
I wouldn't admit that while I was at the job, but I can admit it now. So to be able to work on that and tell a story with them and make that your final statement within your time there, because it brings a nice little bow to the whole thing. So it winds up pretty good.
Yeah. I forgot to ask, besides the Nightwing thing, was there anything that you wanted to do that like you really like one of the top things you really want to do that you weren't able to do because you got too much pushback?
I have That takes up just as much time as one
Okay.
particular
All
moment.
right. All right.
Maybe even more time. Maybe even more time. I had a lot of those. But yeah, that's to be expected. You're always going to run into walls,
Yeah.
and it's how you rebound from that, and what you choose after that is what's it. I'll tell you everything is that I got myself shut down more times than but it never shut me down or stopped me from trying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's evident throughout. I think all the risks that you took in terms of bringing new characters, new talent has was completely
Yeah.
it was just a phenomenal time at DC. So
Yeah.
let's go into Frank Miller Presents. Let's
Yes.
talk about how that teaming up. Obviously, I'm sure the relationship between you and Frank started during your time at DC.
Oh yeah. We love working together. We stayed in touch naturally once I was out, and then ultimately this opportunity came up, and Frank was looking to do books with other publishers, and I said, why do you want to do with other publishers? Why don't we find a way to publish together? And something that I never did, something that he never did, so it allowed us to stretch a new set of muscles, which is what's the most fun thing. You don't want to keep repeating the same gag, so we always got to figure out ways to reinvent ourselves and keep ourselves interested. So this has been interesting, to say the least, in good ways and bad ways, but it's definitely a lot of work, but definitely when you hold those books in your hand that you spent time creating, there's a good special feeling that comes along with that.
Yeah, I mean, the announcement definitely came out of left field. I was not expecting it. Super stoked. I mean, Frank, obviously, I mean, huge name in comics. I mean, he's written probably in my top 5 favorite comics of all time.
Yeah.
Dark Knight Returns, his Daredevil run, just everything he's written, Sin City. So when you guys got together, decided you want to do it, how do you decide what you're going to do? Like, obviously, you're writing a book, Ancient Enemies.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, it works out. It worked out. It starts with Ronin, because I know he's always had a Ronin story that he wanted to do, but we couldn't do it at DC, primarily because, to be honest, he was too expensive to do a book that we only own 50% of. So therefore, but it makes a lot more sense to do it as a new company, independent of everything else. And it was a great starting point for us because of the level of recognition that series has. And he's been wanting to do this for the story for a while. And then by setting him up and working with Philip Tan, he's having a great time with it, because a lot of what this is that Frank Miller Presents is about craft. It's about us feeling that the sense of craft has been lost in comics, and a lot of what is necessary to be good storytellers is being pushed aside. And ultimately, we decided to go back and do books that we believe the right way to do comics. I hate to put it that way, but the types of books that we would like to see and read, and then hopefully see whether or not there's an excitement and audience out there for this type of product. But that goes from building the worlds properly, storytelling, opening up your art to be much more visual in the books instead of oppressive, opening up the coloring so that the colors are brighter, stronger, and not as muted or as muddy on a page as they are right now. And a lot of it is about the construction of the book as it is about the material inside the book itself. And for us, it's something that we believe in, and and we wanted to, push it forward to see whether or not it's the right direction, or there are still people out there hungry for this style of storytelling and this type of story. So we'll see. But I pick up the books, and granted, I'm older, but I think that people enjoy seeing it just the same. And when I did Ancient Enemies, um, I wanted to see the world and take a contemporary look at the world, but still have that sense of scope and adventure and craziness that you expect from a comic book, instead of shrinking it down to what would be two people sitting at a table talking about events, rather than living them out and showing the craziness of the world we're in. Everything what Frank and I are doing is about taking advantage of the medium that we're in. There's an expectation that comes from comics that I think are lost, and we have to go back and put that level of visual level of energy back into the books again. Everything we're doing is artist first, even though you're talking to the writer, it's the artist first. The artist has to matter. You have to open up a book, and it's got to be pretty, and got to be exciting and pull you in. And I feel that's the three books that we're launching with. All three of these books are uniquely different from each other, but the one commonality is the art is beautiful, and I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, as of the day we're speaking, we're talking a couple days before the release of Ancient Enemies and Ronin Book 2. I can't wait to read them personally. I think Philip Tan too on Ronin, like he's definitely invoking a lot of like the layouts. Is Frank pretty heavily involved in terms of?
Oh yeah. What happened was Frank started. The process on Ronin has been fabulous. First, it started with Frank just doing thumbnails and Philip working with them, but Frank wasn't getting from the thumbnails what he wants to do, so he does full layouts on each page, and he gives the layouts and he gives notes and semi-dialogue around the edges of the paper so he can see what's going on the page. And everything's done as a double page spread, even if it has multiple panels. These are double page spreads, so it has a very landscape, large visual approach to it. And then, but when Philip's art started coming back to Frank, Frank got so excited because Philip was able to deliver what he felt was a manga style to this book more than he could ever do on his own. And all of a sudden, now Frank's layouts that were really loose and now pencils and inks. Well, he's like up in his game for Philip. And now I actually have pencils and inks of Frank's from the layouts that honestly I could have published. But that wasn't the point. It was for Frank to better tell the story where it goes, and then Philip returning it back. But he loved the work so much that Philip was doing with his inker Daniel Enriquez, and he actually asked Daniel to do some inks and tones over his cover work because he wanted to make sure Frank wanted to make sure his pencil style matched the style that's inside the book. So it's been this wonderful collaboration of all these guys working together just to really, and they sit around and just talk craft all day and talk about what it is to draw and what are they trying to get from the visuals and the shadowing and and all these different background sets and all that. It's been fun to watch. And same thing with me with Ancient Enemies. I'm from DC, so even though I was working DC, I've always done outline and then script. I've worked much more Marvel style, as the old expression goes. But I used to be able to do page by page breakdowns and very specific about what I wanted on the page. And when I gave it to Danilo Beirut, who's my artist on Ancient Enemies, the pages were fine. But then when I gave him room to open up the storytelling, his storytelling was much better than I even visualized it. And you could see the more latitude and the more freedom I gave to tell stories the way he wanted to do it, the better the art became, and it became more explosive on the page. So by the time I'm writing the first issue, I'm just giving him an outline that tells the length of the story. Don't even do page breakdowns, and he's given these incredible layouts that honestly just brings the level of value up, I think, of the overall book. And honestly, it makes me want to write better to make sure the dialogue doesn't have to explain things, but really allows the dialogue to explain, let the characters to explain who they are and what they're about and their thoughts are. So because the art works so well, and when you have a good book is when you can tell the story without the dialogue, when the artist turns in the pages and you can follow the story clearly. And that's what's great about Danilo on this book. And then what was fun is that since this is Frank Miller Presents, I asked Frank, you got to get involved. It can't be about me. It can't be about Danilo. This is your company. There's a name on it. And ultimately, he presented me a character which was started off as a joke called the Geek, but he fell in love with it in the creation of it. And then I included him in the book. And what I like to say is the Geek is a very harsh-looking character. It's a misformed person. And when I saw it, I'm like, I don't think like this. I don't think like you, Frank. I would never create that character for my book. And that's what makes it special. So
Yeah.
he introduced a character to my book that basically is not any way I knew how to think. And it took me out of my comfort zone a little bit, which was necessary. And it allowed me to create new dynamics for characters because it was this completely different character that people had to react and see differently than all the others. Everybody else can walk amongst each other with no problem. This is a character that could not walk among them because he's so visually different. And that was a lot more fun once I started writing him, and found a way to bring him in. I've had a blast. And but it's good because which is funny because you can tell Frank's married to the character because anytime I show him pages of how I'm writing him, he has notes for me. Oh, you didn't do this right. He doesn't talk like that. I'm like, okay. but the geek character started out as a joke from us because Frank always wanted to pitch me Brother Power the Geek at DC, and I kept on saying no. So naturally, the first character he ever creates for me is called the Geek, just to stick it to me a little bit. That's all right. I don't mind.
That's hilarious. So Ancient Enemies is 6 issues, correct?
Correct.
The first.
Yeah, it's 6 issues, but there's like 4 major storylines that are intertwined throughout this, and I follow 4 groups of people after the world has been after the eastern seaboard has been basically destroyed by an alien spaceship crashing on Earth. And then what you find out is that these aliens that crashed on Earth, they were 2 separate aliens. They were part of a millennial-long war. They were sent to Earth basically to resolve the war as one-on-one combatants. And because these worlds have pushed themselves to a brink. And even though the aliens themselves dies in the crash, they find a way to pass their essences on and their hatreds on and their conflict on to 2 new combatants. So I have these 2 characters that are created that are basically acting out the war on behalf of these aliens. And then all these other characters that have risen in the center are now caught up in the struggle. And it's people choosing sides. But it really is about, I like to put it, against institutionalized hatred. When you hate people for not knowing it, other than the fact it's always been the case. And I have people acting in ways that makes no sense for who they are. But because of what they've become, it makes total sense. And how everybody else gets caught up into these choosing sides and picking things apart is part of the story. But there's four basic characters we're following through. It's there's a character called the Genie who is one of the combatants, and he's this big alien space energy creature that he can turn into, which is what his strength and power is. Then on the other side, there's the character called the First Responder, and you found out that during the crash, when there's all this destruction, one of the first responders that was brought into the situation trying to help put out the fires gets absorbed by the ship and transformed into one of their into one of the alien combatants. And then we also have characters called it's called the Wraith, who is actually the only superhero that existed in the world before the crash. But the title of the book that we're doing with her is called The Wraith and Son, and it's a mother-son superhero team where the son tries to supplant the mother as the hero, and she wants no part of it. So ultimately, they go out together on patrol, which is kind of fun in its own way, but also there's a lot of conflict between the 2 lead characters as they are working out their relationship as they're out on patrol together. So there's enjoyment there. There's your little Nightwing fun little joke there, and for me in some way. And then the last one is a team called the Greater Good, which are 4 different superpowered characters working together. And what I always loved about the expression "the Greater Good" is, because this is from my days at DC also, is concept of greater good everybody shares. They're all working to a greater good. They all believe they're doing something better for the betterment of mankind. But what the greater good stands for different people is different. So ultimately, when people are fighting for something that they believe in, how do you separate that from what's right and what's wrong if it treads on other people's goals or responsibilities? And ultimately, so the greater good is a very driven team and very single-minded in what they're trying to accomplish, even at the expense of everyone else. So it's a little ambiguous about where they sit on the fence, other than they really do believe they're helping mankind at the expense of a lot of other people. So there's a lot of fun groups in there. This isn't a superhero book where we have a villain of the week or anything like that. It's really much more in the sense, I use the expression, it's very much in the sense of New Frontier. When Darwin Cook crafted New Frontier, he told the story of the world, but all these characters moving through it. And here I've got the story of the world and all these new characters that we're seeing it through their eyes. And I'm hoping that people latch on or get excited about different characters. We are doing one-shots with each of the 4 primary characters between the issues of the book, because the book comes out bi-monthly. So you get a full sense of the world, and I've got a lot of this mapped out. I've been working on this for a while, so we got a history and mapped up for each one of our characters. Not something we're going to pour on people right away. We release the information as necessary for what stories are being told, and hopefully the more people learn about them, the more they want to see, and then we could tell more stories with them down the road. But we'll see, one step at a time. I don't want to get ahead of myself. It's about doing this 6-part miniseries and making sure that it's the best book that we can do. And we're not doing them in digital. Everybody asks me about that all the time. One of the reasons why I'm not doing it in digital is that we're really building these books for print, and one size doesn't fit all. You can do a book in print and you can put it on digitally, but sometimes it sacrifices the quality of the print material in order to be on the digital format. And especially with Ronin, where everything's a double-page spread, looking at it on a computer screen might not be the best way to see it. And as I like to say, these are not books to be read on a phone. They're nice, usually visual books, and you should be enjoying the art, and you don't want to squeeze it down and diminish it. You want to really let it open up and breathe. So I'm hoping people enjoy the in print, and ultimately we'll get to digital probably when we collect, but for the individual issues, it's not on any of our game cards.
Yeah, I love hearing that, because I'm old school. I like physical media. I get advanced PDFs sometimes, and I'm like, I'll just wait for the book to come in print, because that's the way it's intended to be read. It's not, like you said, like, why look at it on a phone? You're losing the quality of the art. And one thing you kind of mentioned about being for print, the ash can you guys put out was kind of like a newsprint.
Oh yeah, we did that on purpose.
Yeah, I love that. I love newsprint. Like, I mean, I'm one of those fans that, like, I love the smell of old comics. So
yeah, it had that smell, believe it or not. I opened up the box, I'm like, wow, I can smell comics. We went for a really it's porous, uncoated paper, and ultimately why we did that was a couple of reasons. We wanted to evoke that feeling of being a comic company again, but also I wanted to test the coloring. And as I said, we're doing a less saturated look on colors. I don't like just because you have 1,000 colors to choose from doesn't mean you should put them on every page you draw, which is what you're seeing over and over again in comics right now. No sense of reasoning or coloring or separation or backgrounds or foregrounds or anything going on, and coloring is just a disaster in comics at this moment. But for me, I wanted to do something where we desaturated the colors. We can see the colors a lot easier. And for me, if you were on a porous paper, which means it's very absorbent, you have to be very careful, because if you overcolor, it's just going to turn into a sea of mud. So therefore, it forced us to pull our color palette back, which worked. It looked good on that paper, which means it looked even better on a matted paper, because the matted paper at least bring a little better shine to it. So the rest of the book should be on matted paper, but it doesn't mean we won't revisit the newsprint every once in a while for fun, just for the fun of it.
All right, cool.
We had a blast doing that, though. We did.
And then you said, like, you're probably doing a lot more now in this position than at DC, because there's other people that you can delegate stuff to. So how much more work are you doing in terms of calling printers and stuff like that, and dealing with paper stocks?
Yeah, doing it all. It's not even that. It's sales, solicitation material, talking to retailers, talking to the printers, checking out on the talent, trying to get your own book done. If anything, and it's going to sound funny, but it certainly makes you appreciate the staff that you had at DC a lot more. Because there's such minutia, and I'll own it right now. We talked about reading things on a phone. Well, don't ever review a book on a phone. That's what I'm going to tell you right now. I proofed the book on a phone, and guess I missed the fact that the first issue Ronin and the first issue Ancient Enemies, the price dropped off the cover, and I didn't know it because I couldn't see it. And I was in little things, and then ultimately went to press with it. So we had to correct it later. But the bottom line is I have books that didn't have price on it because I just missed it. And I used to have that safety net, and I don't have that safety net now. But you know what? That's fun for me. It just makes you want to be better about it. Doesn't make you want to go hire 20 people, because we can't. But it does make you want to be more aware of what goes into everything. And I can't tell you how much time and energy has been spent talking about barcodes, more than I ever want to discuss ever again.
So you guys have
it's a thing.
Yeah, you have Ancient Enemies, Ronin book 2. You got Pandora as well, and then I know that there was ads in the ash can for like some Sin City stuff.
Yeah.
What else in terms of plans for growing the line do you guys have? Like,
Yeah, we're gonna grow slowly. I mean, I don't want to do too much probably right now. We're just looking at 2 books, 2 titles per month. That's
yeah,
about it. Just 2 issues per month, just because that's all we can manage at the time, and we want to grow slow. We want to also maintain quality on what we're doing. We do have a special crossover. I'm a big horror movie fan, and there's a horror host on Svengoolie, which is on MeTV
yeah,
on Saturday nights. And they have a rather large following, over 1 million viewers every Saturday night, and we set up an agreement to do a couple of one-shots with them, which is fun because I know the people, and I felt that they couldn't take those things anywhere else because they're friends of mine. So I want to make sure we did them right, and I'm having fun doing those books. But the Sin City books are going to be big for us, and then following that. It really counts on the success of the material. I don't want to go out and start to schedule all sorts of crazy things, but both Frank and I have a commitment to creating at least 1 new title per year over that first 5 years of the company. More if things work out well. But the reality is we have a plan in place that we know we want to do more new things. I know what my next 2 projects are. Frank knows what his next 2 projects are. It's just
yeah.
about timing it out properly and making sure that there's an audience there ready and waiting for these books when we have them done.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm super. Like I said, I'm super excited for the line. I think that's also like it's cool that if there's only a couple a month, like you can be all in on something like that instead of it being like 10 titles, because comics are not as cheap as they once were. You know, I mean, you go in and drop $10, you're only getting 2 comics. When I was a kid,
Yeah.
I could get like 8 comics for $10.
Well, yeah, I mean, also, and our books are $7.99, and the first issue of Ancient Enemies is 64 pages of story. First issue of Ronin's 52 pages of story. So there's a lot of value there. We're
Yeah,
bi-monthly, so my logic is when we get down to 48 pages at $7.99, we're the same as a $4 comic
right.
if you bought it monthly, and I'm hoping people realize that and don't get price shy. But the goal is for people to read the books. We're not doing variant covers other than 1 and 1 in 25 variant as an incentive only. We're not doing 10 covers or 20 covers to just drive sales. I've had retailers reaching out to me for custom covers, and they were going to do substantial purchases, and we walked away from it because we don't want to take the attention off the interior of the material. We're not here selling covers. We're here selling comics and story. And if people aren't buying it for comics and story, then we see no reason to create them. We're not in this business to make a lot of money. We're in this business to be storytellers. So we have to be in that spot where people are reading our stories. And if they're not, that's okay. We don't need to do them if that's the case, but for me, we have stories to tell, and we're hoping that people enjoy them going, as they come out.
Yeah, dude. I like I said, I can't wait. Super excited. I wish it was Wednesday already, so I could go
Yeah,
read the
almost there.
comics.
Me too. This has been driving me crazy for a while. Trust me, I've been doing this wild countdown for the longest time. So
Yeah.
we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're getting. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I said, I think the books look great. I definitely want some more newsprint, so I hope you definitely visit that again.
You and Frank. Frank's all over the newsprint. Like Frank wanted to put Ronin on newsprint. I said, can't do it. Not at the price we're charging.
Yeah, well, it looked like you said, the books look great. I can't wait. I'm super happy for you guys doing this launch and stuff. And I want to again thank you for joining me for a chat. Talk some comics. It's been a blast.
As I said, this is the fun part for me. Is we're going very grassroots with this. It's the only way I can describe it. After being with a major company, just doing top line stuff, I really want to get back and talk to the fans, get back in the stores, get back to conventions, and just do things where we're talking about comics. Everything's gotten so away from the comic conversation. Everything's about the characters, but nothing's about the comics. And I think we got to talk about the books again, or else we become superfluous to everything else. And I always said at DC, the books have to lead. We have to be the leaders. We have to be the creators of the IP. We have to be the visionaries. We have to be the storytellers and let everybody else build off of our stories rather than the other way around. And for us right now, for Frank and myself, we both had extensive careers in other medium. But we both gravitated back to comics because this is where we want to tell our stories. And we're not looking at these things being films or TV shows or anything. We're just looking at being the best comics they can be. And that's the plan.
All right. Well, I'm here for it. I know a lot of people are excited about the books. For everybody listening and watching, I will drop some links down where you can follow Dan on social media. Frank Miller Presents as well. Make sure you get out there, go support the books. And Dan, thank you again for taking time to chat with me this morning.
My pleasure, Ryan. Have a good day now.
All right, you
Okay?
too.
Thanks, son. Bye.